Greetings and welcome to episode 40 of the Sustaining the Herd podcast, brought to you by Sechi Agri-Services and Engineering of Raymond, Nebraska. I'm Andrew Wadle, your co-host, and I'm joined in the studio with my co-host, Brock Vitek.
Hey there, Andrew.
Hi, Brock. And we're also joined in the studio today with our very special guest, Mark Stoermann, the COO of Newtrient.
Hello, Andrew.
Hi, Mark. We're really glad to have you. And I should also mention that we are broadcasting to you from the American Biogas Council's Business of Biogas meeting. And we'll talk a little bit more about Business of Biogas and kind of what we're doing here. But before we do that, just for our new listeners, just want to tell you a little bit about Sustaining the Herd, what it is all about. And well, first off, welcome back to our past listeners, our existing listeners and guests. We appreciate the feedback we get from you, and we're glad you kind of came back to join us. And then also for our new listeners, just tell you a little bit about what Sustaining the Herd is all about. And so Sustaining the Herd to Sechi Agri-Services and Engineering is kind of like three pillars. And the first is maybe what a lot of people often think about sustainability, and that is clean air and clean water. That's just one part of sustainability. And in our particular instance, it's how does animal agriculture coexist with society? And oftentimes air and water is that interface. So of course we want to keep any contaminants and nutrients and things like that out of our air and water. The second is resource efficiency. Doing more with less is a big part of sustainability, and agriculture continues to be an example of an industry that continues to improve and continues to become more efficient and more conscious of using resources. And the last is kind of more of a softer side of sustainability, and that is our sustainable businesses. We need to have businesses that are profitable and people that are coming into these businesses in our industry, and that all goes into sustainable businesses. So with that, Mark, tell us about yourself and tell us about Newtrient.
Well, thanks, Andrew. I grew up, my uncle was a dairy farmer in central Minnesota, and I spent a lot of time out there and kind of worked my way through college working at a Kraft cheese plant and started working in the dairy processing industry. My first job was with Michigan milk producers. And from there, worked through several positions on the processing side, and then eventually ended up as a project manager at Fair Oaks Dairy Farms, working with the farms in the Fair Oaks area on sustainability projects as a project manager for anaerobic digesters and CNG fleets and things like that. And then that led to an opportunity to come to work for Newtrient. And Newtrient's a company that was founded by the dairy cooperatives themselves. And the real purpose is to reduce the environmental impact of the dairy on their communities and make it sustainable to do that. And, my wife says that's a mouthful, Mark. Could you be a little clearer? And I said, well, a lot of times it's, how can you make money from manure? That's what Newtrient's been doing for the past 10 years now. And, we continue to try to work and provide resources like our Newtrient technology catalog and, information on the Newtrient.com website on what are the right things to do and how can you do that and what kind of resources are out there for people.
And, one of the benefits of kind of having personal relationships with our guests oftentimes is, Brock and I kind of know when you're sandbagging a bit, right? Because, everybody in agriculture is kind of humble in things that they do and don't really toot their own proverbial horn, so to speak. And I think one of the things that you did while you were at Fair Oaks that I think is really important to know because it set the stage for where we are today, and that is, and we had the pleasure of working together on this, and that is the first anaerobic digesters that were successfully operated for a long term with sand-laden manure.
Well, there would be a little bit of argument about the very first one being operated successfully, but you're right. Here at the Business of Biogas, we hear a lot about what makes a successful project. And it's really the integration of good vendors and good equipment suppliers and good operators. And then it's a commitment and it's a lot of work. And particularly with sand-laden dairy manure, it was a learning curve, and we really had to learn, what the right sand looked like. We had to learn how to manage it, how to bring it from the dairy barns and the stalls, and how to get into the digester sometimes when it was very cold outside and things like that. And so through a lot of trial and error and a lot of hard work by the good people at Fair Oaks, there was an opportunity to learn. And I think that was the first digester that sustained, as you said, a very long history of operating on sand-laden dairy manure.
That's right.
That's great, Mark. I'd like to ask, you've been in the industry for a while, and I imagine you've seen a lot of change over the years. So what are the biggest changes you've seen in the biogas and anaerobic digestion industries through your career?
Well, I think it's not necessarily been a change in the technology, but the automation has gotten a lot better. And the programming and those sort of things to be able to help operators operate and maintain things remotely. And then the business models really changed. When we were building digesters and I first started the digester projects, it was the dairies and the dairy producers who were investing in the project. And there wasn't a lot of return. A lot of times it was, just kind of a break-even situation, but they were doing it for, odor issues, and they were doing it, to produce some electricity and lower some costs. But it was really, there wasn't a really sustained economic reason to do it. And that's changed a little bit with some of the newer incentives like the LCFS and the Renewable Fuel Standard. And so the LCFS being the low carbon fuel standard in California. And I think when the industry saw those incentives come in and saw that there was an opportunity for more profitable digester projects,
Sure.
that brought in more developers. And I would say right now, you can never say, completely, but I'd say right now the majority of digester projects are actually being driven by developers. And that's a two-edged sword. In some respects, that was a good thing, because for a dairy farmer, he's already running.
They already have a day job.
Well, or several.
Yep.
Yes.
And then to add one more thing, that was truly a job of creating a renewable energy facility. In a lot of situations, it didn't always get the attention it needed. And so having a separate entity there with its own employees whose own responsibility was to make sure that they were keeping that operation running and profitable, made a big difference on the performance of the systems, and I believe on the profitability of those projects. It's understandable if you're a dairy producer and the feed wagon goes down and the digester gas upgrader goes down. One of them, if you don't fix it, cows die. The other one will sit there and wait until you come back. And so the flare goes off and you're literally burning what you could make profits because you have to fix the feed wagon. And when you have a division of labor where you have a developer and they have a crew of people that are running the digester and responsible for that, then there isn't that dynamic of the dairy producer having to make that decision. There's somebody to take care of that problem. He can just take care of his cows.
Yep. And then the developers also presumably have investors that they need to be looking after, and so they're really, really focused on uptime of plants.
They are, but it's still important that the farm and that developer and whoever they have operating it, because it's not always the developer's employees. Sometimes they have a third-party operator, but that good communication between those entities is really, really important, because digesters and, really anything only operates as good as the resources that you're giving and the feedstocks that you're getting. And if the dairy doesn't understand, well, you can't change the sand in your bedding because we've designed a system based on getting this type of sand out, and you just went to something much finer and now it's filling our digester tanks. That can be a problem. So you have to have good communication, and you have to have a good understanding and a good working relationship between all of those groups.
Yeah. And I think, again, this is a plug for Business of Biogas meeting. I think the sessions that they have here should be required for all developers because of the fact that there's just the things that you just talked about. There's certain stopgate types of things that need to happen in the development of a process in order to ensure success.
I think it would be good if the developers brought some of their dairy partners along, because just understanding, yesterday we had, the digester master class, and there was a group of 10 people, each representing different parts of the digester project cycle, and and I don't believe there was a lawyer up there, and I'm pretty sure there wasn't a dairyman up there. And, so there were a couple of more that had to be involved. But when you start talking about things like permitting, and then you start talking about, the people who are the asset managers and are helping to work through the startup and the handover from startup to operations and things like that, just having an idea of that scope and understanding, the expression I use to dairy producers is they're going to be put a multi-million-dollar facility next to your multi-million-dollar facility. And as much as they need to know about you, you kind of need to understand what they need to be successful as well.
It's a two-way street.
Absolutely.
Andrew, that makes me think about the same conference in October of last year. We recorded a podcast with none other than Lynn Bodwine of Bodwine Farms near Baltic, South Dakota.
Who Mark surely knows.
Who Mark knows Lynn. And so Lynn was our podcast guest here last year, and Andrew moderated the panel that Lynn spoke on. We also had another dairy producer, and it was great to have their voices in the room talking about this from their perspective as producers. And I think you've underscored the importance. We cannot emphasize that enough, that developers and producers need to be talking to each other and understanding where one another are coming from in order to have successful projects.
That integration is so important, and understanding and being able to relate. And I think once people see what the other side is doing, it makes for a better relationship. And I've said many times when I'm talking to dairymen who've called me and said, what do you think of these projects? That, some projects, good projects, don't get done because the farm gets too greedy, and others don't get done because the developer gets too greedy. And you guys need to talk. And when you're done talking with each other, then switch places and then argue it from the other side, so that at the end of the day, a good project is a project that, 5 years down the road, you'd still say, yeah, I'd do that again.
Right.
I've got a good relationship with the people I'm doing it with, and we structured this in a way that we take care of each other. And if I had to do it again, I'd do it with the same group.
Yeah.
Now, that's probably not going to be where any project's going to be 2 days after startup, but you got to give it a little time. Yeah. But there's always unexpected things. But you've got to be working together for each one to be successful.
Yeah. And one of the pieces of advice that I give developers is, the biogas piece is the really sexy piece of a project, right? There's stainless steel and there's membranes, and this is all, but there is a dairy farm part of the equation, right?
Absolutely.
And it needs as much, if not, I'll even call it equal attention to that part of the project that's kind of really, really sexy because of the fact that, for all the things you just mentioned, but, there's also this piece of where, yes, the digester is connected to the dairy on the influent side. And so, yep, the influent needs to be just right. But, we're seeing projects now where on the digestate side, on the discharge side, both from the quality of I won't say the quality, the composition of the digestate, both from an agronomic perspective, as well as you have water that might be repurposed as processed water back on the dairy. And so the dairy and the digesters, whatever euphemism you want to use, linked, married, chained together, whatever it is, they are one. And, in the engineering world, we always talk about it as where do you draw the boundary of the digester system? And Brock's heard me say many times that the boundary of the system goes out to the road and out to the farthest farm field and absolutely everything in between. Mm-hmm. That is the digester system.
Yeah, it really is. And, Andrew, we've talked in some recent episodes about the work we're doing with digestion in the beef cattle feedlot industry. And boy, I think, are we seeing some of these lessons being learned in real time that folks like Mark and dairy producers and yourself with your dairy industry experience as well maybe learned or saw many years ago. The feedlot industry is going through that same stuff now, and others have been through it before.
Yeah.
Well, but it's an interesting thing, too, about the current situation, because we are in a bit of a lull here in the revenue coming from projects and things like that. But there's still things that are happening on farm to address environmental issues and to try to help farms manage their manure. And so part of doing that now is, what Newtrient does is try to provide technical assistance and implementation support, but we try to do it in a way that it's not going to negatively impact a farm's ability to maybe do a bigger project later on. So when we talk about digestate, sometimes people misunderstand that a digester is really just a carbon play. It doesn't take ammonia out. It doesn't take phosphorus out. It doesn't take potassium out. All of those nutrients are still there. Some of them change in form a little bit, but they're all there. And you still have coarse fibers, and you still have all of those things that were in the manure originally still have to be managed. And so coming out of a digester, and then, for example, in the beef feedlot industry, where you were used to dealing with dry material that was stacked up and hauled away on, dump trucks, all of a sudden now you have this liquid stream, and you have millions of gallons of liquid stream.
And these guys are figuring this out now in a big way, Mark, and it's daunting, as you can imagine, because of the fact that this dry manure was something, just an easy product to give away or even sell. It's almost like your social license to exist with your crop farmer neighbors. And I say, by the way, we were getting, thousands of tons of this dry stuff. Next year it's going to be, I don't know, 80 million, gallons? Gallons.
None of your equipment will work to apply
Right.
it. It's all going to be different. And that is a challenge. And that's one of the things that I think as different industries adopt, we saw a lot when we were starting the digesters, that there were a lot of municipal systems, municipal treatment equipment that was tried at the dairy, and the fiber screwed it all up.
Yeah.
I mean, and so it's not always as simple to make the switch as just the developer putting enough water in there. You've also now got to figure out, okay, now how do I haul all of that liquid material, and how do I apply it in a way that it's still at a proper agronomic rate? It's not going to affect my yields. It's not going to affect my neighbors. It's not going to cause odors that weren't there before. And I'm not saying that digesters cause odors. Generally, they reduce them significantly. But applying liquid manure to a field that's never seen it, that has a neighbor, they might smell that digestate and go, that's something different. And we all know in the industry that people smell with their eyes. If they see something being applied, even if it's just water, they're occasionally calling and saying what's going on. So it's important to communicate up front what you're doing and what the impact is, and then to take that opportunity to educate those people in your community on the benefits and the changes that are going to take place.
And Mark, that's kind of a great segue to Newtrient, and you gave a great introduction of Newtrient, and I'm going to describe it what it looks like to me as a user, because it is something that we use. And so, short order, I'd say it's kind of like if the old extension service would have had the special forces, from the standpoint that back in the old days, the extension service would take a technology and they'd go out to the farm and they'd test it and they'd hold a field day and they'd, basically sort some of this stuff out, help develop it more, et cetera. And so for an engineer, the way modern day Newtrient, well, the way we would use it is you'd say, all right, we need solid separation. And I go on the Newtrient website and I go to, I forget whether it's a drop down or a search or whatever, and I search solid separation and I get everybody who manufactures and sells solid separators, in all the time, every day, right down to the people who hope and dream to maybe manufacture in some way. But the best part is that you guys sort those out, and so you guys vet the technologies that you then go ahead and put it if you would put it in the way you guys view that.
We do have a criteria. We call it a 9-point scale, and it essentially, once you kind of get used to it, you can look at that graphic on the side, and you can say, oh, I know those first three things relate to how many of them do they have out in the field. And I know those next three things are related to, the economics and the value proposition and the cost, operating cost and capital cost. And I know the last three things are kind of related to, the funding and the revenue streams and things like that. And so when you start to see the 9 points all lit up, all colored.
And those points are criteria.
Yeah, those are actually criteria. Yeah. And on the website, you can mouse over and it'll tell you what each of those are. And then we actually have gone beyond just that rating system to, there are some technologies that are Newtrient recognized. We recognize them as the leader in the field. And then there are some that we label as emerging. And technologies to kind of keep an eye on, things that, they maybe aren't on 50 farms, but,
there's promise.
The 5 that they're on, this is pretty interesting. And, it's interesting to see all the different things that potentially are coming. And then it's interesting that you mentioned the extension services, which are still doing great work. But one of the big challenges we have right now is at the national level is organizations like the NRCS and things like that. We don't really have the resources to bring those together. So one of the things Newtrient did in its infancy, one of my first jobs was building out that website and making information available for the farmers. And then after we grew a little bit more, some of the other players in the industry, the co-ops themselves, came to us and was like, can you help us with some of these questions that we're getting on sustainability and things like that. And so then we started working with the co-ops and the farmers. And now Newtrient has actually started to work with those consumer goods, packaged goods companies and things like that to try to bring everybody together to put together projects. And again, projects that can make an impact right now and bring value to the farm right now, and yet still are adaptable enough that if down the road electricity prices get very high and it makes sense for a digester to be put in to generate electricity on a farm, there's still that opportunity, and they haven't wasted money by doing something that kind of excluded another technology. And so those are some of the challenges we're trying to address. We love working with NRCS, and we've just finishing up a conservation innovation grant where we studied 15 different technologies over the course of the last 5 years to really do a deep dive and see what their impact on water quality would be. We developed a nice criteria with Washington State University where we really do an extensive sampling program. So it's not a 3-week trial. It's more like 15 weeks and 3 samples a week. So you have statistically valid numbers that you can look at. And so all of that information, it finds its way to Newtrient.com, and all of it's freely available to people to be able to review what these technologies do and how they might be able to apply them.
Mark, what technologies or areas of opportunity do you think hold the most promise when considering all of the challenges we've discussed here for manure management in general, as well as within biogas and anaerobic digestion?
Well, I think the opportunities for biogas and anaerobic digestion really lie in the markets. And as we see additional demand for renewable energy, different additional opportunities for using that within the supply chain to lower, in our case, the carbon footprint of a gallon of milk or yogurt or ice cream, there's where some of those opportunities come in. When we talk about the up and coming technologies and where can we do, there's an interesting technology that we tested as part of the SIG. It's actually available in Europe, but they haven't got all the electrical work done, and it's called N2 Applied. And it's literally ionizing air and injecting it into a manure stream to reduce the pH and increase the amount of nitrogen in the slurry. So it gets closer to a balanced fertilizer product without having to go out and buy fertilizer. And so you end up with something, if you have some sort of renewable energy source, you can end up with a low environmental impact natural fertilizer that is essentially your manure with nitrogen added from the air. So, some really fascinating work in things like that. And then, just getting those coarse solids out. I mentioned that the difficulty that a lot of technologies had when we first started looking at them was they couldn't handle that. There's some tried and true methods for those that, right now, even getting some of those solids out can get you some environmental credits. And, those are the things that we're currently seeing a lot of interest in.
Sure. And even with all of that being said, Mark, I imagine there are still some gaps or some areas that we need to focus on and do some more problem solving. So where should companies be focusing as they continue to work to develop new technology and new solutions to address these problems?
I think the technical advisors is where we really need the help. And, that's where your company, does a great job, because you have engineers and you have experience and you can sit down and you can start to put things together. But then we also need the people who can help find that funding to bring it in and also make the explanation to the packaged goods company. And then you have to have the monitoring and the people who facilitate the trades and things like that. And I think all of that kind of interconnection, Newtrient does it to some extent. We work with a company called Athian as a livestock carbon trading program and platform. So
I'm familiar with Athian.
And, full disclosure, Newtrient invested in Athian as a seed investor because we knew there's something, we needed somebody out there who actually knew how to work with animal agriculture. Unlike and nothing against the crop guys, but, they work on a 1-year cycle. And one time a year they're buying seed, and one time a year they're doing their harvest. And, at the end of the harvest, when everything's done, they can get their carbon credits, and that's their cycle. But we get a feed bill every month. and that one time a year, that doesn't quite work out in animal agriculture. And so getting that balanced and then being able to look and develop protocols for what deserves a credit and what are the opportunities that should be available has been one of the kind of most inventive things, and that's going forward to really close those gaps. And so those technical advisors, those people who can put all of those pieces together, that's I think where the real gap is. And I don't want to leave out our friends. You mentioned extension, but at the universities as well. I mean, some of the young people, one of the exciting things as we go out and we try to help dairies and areas develop roadmaps for how they can reduce their environmental impact. One of the real pleasures is meeting some of the young dairy producers that we see, and some of the young people that are working in the agencies like NRCS and things like that. I mean, we have some quite frankly, brilliant young people who are entering the industry. And it's pretty heartening for an older guy like me to see that, hey, there's somebody else who might be interested in manure after I end up retiring. So
that's really cool. And so when you, I'm thinking you would have access to these metrics, but when you look on the Newtrient website, what is the technology that's searched up the most? What's what I think is a good indication of what producers think is the biggest thing they've got going on.
That's interesting because it kind of depends what was the last webinar or what was the last podcast on. It kind of follows that trend.
Okay.
Like after Biogas Americas, or which is usually in the spring of the year, or the business of biogas, we always see a little uptick in looking at those technologies. And then, as we get into the spring of the year, when everybody's kind of trying to figure out what fertilizers they need and things like that, then all of a sudden you'll see nutrient recovery and stuff like that. So it is kind of seasonal. It is kind of regional, but and you'd be surprised how many different, entities and different people get on that website. So I don't have a really great answer for that because it's a lot of different ones.
And on that subject of nutrient separation, nutrient segregation, are there any technologies out there? And of course, you don't have to name vendors or whatnot, but what technologies are that you're seeing that really show the most promise?
Well, I would say for coarse solid separation, and depends a little bit on the region. So if you're in a region where you don't need to worry about snow and ice and freezing, slope screens do a really good job getting the coarse particles and squeezing that out. And if you get more into those areas where you're putting it inside a building and things like screw presses, I particularly like screw presses that are supported on each end so you don't get wobble and you're not tearing the screen with it. But there's some really good pieces of equipment by multiple different vendors there. And then once you get that fiber out, now you can start really going after the nutrients. And the nutrient that tends to cause the most angst, if you will, is the phosphorus, because you're loading. Dairy manure has more phosphorus than you really need for putting it on corn if you put on the right amount of nitrogen. And so there are some polymer assisted technologies that can get a significant amount of phosphorus out, up to 80%, and that goes with those finest particles. Right. And so we've heard of different opportunities, but most of them require some sort of polymer to basically pull that fine particle out, and then you end up with something that looks like black Play-Doh, but you don't want your kids to play with.
That's right.
And Mark, what kind of technologies are those that pull the phosphorus out? Is it a centrifuge? Like what types of systems are you talking about here?
Well, you can use a centrifuge, and that will get a higher percentage of solids, and that will get some of the phosphorus out. If you use a centrifuge with polymer, you kind of have an odd mix, because you have a polymer that uses a molecular bond that's very, kind of delicate to create a flock. And then you use this shear force that's not delicate to try to get it out. But there are other technologies like moving disc presses and vibratory screens and things like that. The key is, once you can pull all those particles together to somehow dewater it, and then you have a solution that's low in suspended solids, and then you have the dissolved solids there, and you're going to still have some orthophosphorus, and you're going to have your nitrogen and your potassium, but now you're not going to plug up a nozzle on a center pivot, or you're going to have the opportunity to deal with that product, maybe mixing it off with water to get everything in balance, those sort of things, in an irrigation situation through a center pivot. So, lots of different technologies fall into those categories of coarse separation, fine separation, nutrient application, things like that. And, but it's really the goal of Newtrient to try to help dairy farms get to the point where they're putting in what's right for their farm. And, somebody at one of the conference, speakers said today, sellers are going to sell. And, if you're selling hammers, everything looks like a nail. And so what we're out there trying trying to make sure is that you're hanging Tiffany china, right? You don't really want to buy a hammer in this situation. Right. So we want to see projects that are the right technologies for the right farm, and that gives the best opportunity for both the technology providers, anybody else who's involved in it, and the farm to have a long-term successful career.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important to note that we've talked a lot about dairy, but these technologies that we've talked about and the nutrient database, it's kind of non-denominational, right? Although you haven't vetted it in beef and haven't vetted it in swine, it could be a place for people to start.
Yes, I would agree with that. We do know that we get visitors that are from the regulatory space and from the poultry side of the barnyard and the beef operations. It's not exclusive in that respect. At the same time, just like there are, lots of religions out there and everybody picks their one, we're dedicated to the dairy industry and we're working with that in mind. But the fact that the information is worthwhile out there is certainly, something. It becomes a resource for more than just the dairy community.
That's great to hear, Mark. As we start to wrap up the conversation, I'd like to zoom out for a moment and ask you to put your hat of wisdom on and ask, when you look at the future of manure management, what do you see?
If I were to zoom out and say what would be the ideal situation, it would be that we would have more circularity within the dairy and within the value chain. I think we kind of mentioned it. We'd be generating electricity and renewable natural gas that could fuel our trucks and power our plants. And the renewable natural gas could be used for, running the boilers that are pasteurizing the milk. We'd have the nutrients getting back to the farm in a way that they could be used in a very agronomic way to really benefit the soil and build that up. And then we'd have that sustainable relationship between the people that are doing each of those pieces so that it is interconnected and it's all supporting each other's success. The hardest thing is to see all the people working with the right motives and see a project not succeed. And so we just really want to get to the point where we can bring all the right people together with each project that we are part of and see them have that opportunity and ultimately succeed and have a operation that really runs well and works for everyone that's involved in it.
That's a future I want to live in. I don't know. What do you think, Andrew?
Absolutely. And in episodes, we talk about the people in town, and the people in town are our customers, right? And there's a lot more of them than there are of us. And everything that you just described is what the people in town want.
Well, and the people on the edge of town want nice land and the opportunity not to smell when you're putting the fertilizer down. And I think we can get those sort of benefits too, those intangible. There isn't a way to put a dollar figure on somebody able to watch the sunset when you've just applied manure in the next field, right? But that's an important part of being a good neighbor and supporting those people in town. So I think maybe the people in town need to make a few more trips out to see places, like Fair Oaks Visitor Center and things like that. So they have a little more understanding of how their food is produced. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to improve and to do it in a way that will help them to be supportive of our industry as well.
Yeah, producers and those of us who work in industry could probably make a few more trips to town to hear what those folks have to say as well. It's a two-way street, right?
Absolutely. We're looking out at the skyline of St. Louis here, and so we're in town this week.
Yeah, we can see the arch from our mobile recording studio here. I wish you all could see it with us, the arch and the mighty Mississippi River right out the window.
That's right. And Mark, we want to really thank you for joining us today. It's absolutely a pleasure for me, and almost like a walk down memory lane, because you and I have worked together, weaving in and out as projects as necessary for almost 25 years. And I don't know about you, but I can't say I've worked with many people and keep in contact with many people for 25 years. So it's an honor for you to be part of our podcast today, and great working with you.
Well, and it's been a great privilege to work with all of the great people like yourself in projects like this. And then, I remember when I used to ask about your races, and now I ask about your son's races, and just to grow within a community. And this is a community. One of the things I would say, for people who are thinking about, well, what do I want to be in the future, is there are advantages to working with agriculture and working outside, and you can make relationships that last a long, long time. And that's kind of the frosting on the cake for me is, seeing, like I said, seeing the young people that are coming into the industry, but maybe some of us that are getting a little longer in the tooth and can go back down some of those paths and remember some of those experiences. So
yep, and ag people are great people to work with. And on this exact same subject, I've mentioned in past episodes that if you are working in food, fuel, and water, you will never go hungry. And when we sit here and talk about biogas and anaerobic digester systems, emphasis on the systems.
Absolutely.
We are talking about food, fuel, and water.
Andrew, you must be an engineer, the way you emphasize systems there.
How'd you guess?
Love to hear it. Well, yeah, Mark, once again, thank you so much for saying yes to being our guest today. And for all of our listeners, both new and returning, thank you all for once again choosing to spend some time with us for episode 40. That's right, Andrew, episode 40.
Big 40.
Time's flying.
Big 40.
Thanks for choosing to join us for another episode here. And we've enjoyed this with you today, and we look forward to being back with you again in a couple of weeks. Until then, thanks for joining the herd today.